My son couldn't stop staring at the stranger's brand new boots, the leather still stiff and dark and barely scuffed, while his own sat wrapped tightly in twine at the sole, because I hadn't found 40 cents to spare for a cobbler in going on 3 long months. I whispered to him that we'd make do with what we had, the same tired promise I'd been making since his father died 2 winters before. And I never expected the quiet man standing at the counter ahead of us to hear a single word of it. Looking back, I understand now that he heard every word, and that the particular quality of his silence afterward was already the beginning of something neither Danny nor I had any reason yet to hope for. Our small rented house sat at the edge of town, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen that Thomas and I had moved into the year Danny was born, close enough to walk to both the schoolhouse and the 3 families whose washing kept us fed, far enough from the town's more prosperous streets that I rarely had occasion to encounter its wealthier residents beyond the ordinary business of buying supplies. I'd grown accustomed, over 2 years of careful widowhood, to a particular rhythm of scraping and managing that left little room for anything beyond bare survival. A rhythm I'd told myself, more times than I could count, represented simply the honest shape of my life now, rather than any particular tragedy worth dwelling on. We'd walked into Whitfield's general store that October afternoon for flour and coffee, the last of what little credit Mr. Whitfield still extended me against the modest wages I earned taking in washing for 3 families in town. Work that kept us fed most weeks, but left precious little over for anything beyond the barest necessities. Danny's boots had been failing for a month by then, the soles splitting a little further with each week of walking to school and back, and I'd told him, more times than I liked admitting even to myself, that we'd manage until spring thaw brought better weather and, God willing, a little more work my way. I'd tried mending the boots myself twice already that autumn, using a needle and waxed thread I kept for exactly such emergencies. But the leather had worn too thin in places to hold a stitch properly, and each repair lasted only a week or 2 before giving way again along some new seam. Mr. Whitfield had mentioned, not unkindly, that his own cobbler charged 40 cents for a proper resoling, a sum that might as well have been $4 given how little slack existed in my weekly accounting after rent and food and the coal we'd need before winter fully set in. If I couldn't find a way to keep him properly shod through the coming winter, I risked more than his simple comfort. A Kansas winter took toes and sometimes worse from children whose families couldn't afford decent boots, a fact I'd watched happen to a neighbor's boy the previous January and had carried as a private, constant fear ever since. The boy had lost 2 toes on his left foot, a fact the whole town had discussed in hushed, sympathetic tones for weeks afterward. And I remembered standing in my own kitchen hearing the news, looking down at Danny's own small feet, and understanding with a clarity that had never fully left me since exactly how thin the margin ran between ordinary hardship and genuine catastrophe for a family in our particular circumstances. That fear sat under every small daily calculation I made, the particular arithmetic of a widow stretching thin wages across rent and food and whatever else a growing boy needed. Arithmetic that rarely balanced in our favor no matter how carefully I managed it. The stranger at the counter was buying rope and nails, ordinary ranch supplies that told me nothing about him beyond the evident fact that he could afford considerably more than the modest quantities he was purchasing. His own boots and coat plainly finer than anything most men in that store wore on an ordinary Tuesday. I noticed, too, the particular unhurried way he moved through his transaction with Mr. Whitfield, a man clearly unbothered by the small delays and courtesies of a country store, not rushing the storekeeper despite his evident means to conduct his business anywhere with considerably more speed and privacy. That patience struck me, even before he'd said a word to either of us, as belonging to a different category of wealthy man than the few others I'd encountered in town, men who typically moved through such ordinary transactions with the particular brisk impatience of people who considered a country store's slower pace beneath their proper attention. I noticed him mostly because Danny noticed him first, my son's eyes fixed with the particular unguarded longing only a child manages on those new dark boots, and I'd whispered my usual quiet promise to look away, to want less, to make do, before the stranger had given any indication at all that he'd heard us. He turned, once Mr. Whitfield had finished tallying his purchase, and looked at Danny with an expression I couldn't immediately read, something considering rather than pitying, which mattered to me more than I could have explained at the time, having grown weary over 2 years of the particular flavor of pity that made a person feel smaller rather than simply seen. He asked Danny plainly, man to boy, whether he was partial to boots or simply admiring the leather, and Danny, startled at being addressed directly by a stranger, managed only a small nod before ducking his face against my skirt. I remember feeling, in that particular moment, an odd mixture of embarrassment at my son's evident longing and something close to gratitude that the stranger had addressed him directly rather than simply pretending not to notice, the way most adults typically managed such awkward moments. There was something in the plain, unhurried way he'd crouched slightly to bring himself nearer Danny's eye level that struck me as unusual for a man of his evident means. A small physical courtesy that most wealthy men I'd encountered rarely extended to a poor widow's child. The stranger introduced himself as Nathaniel Cross, a rancher from 20 miles west of town, in for supplies before winter set in proper, and I gave him my own name in return, Margaret Hale, along with Danny's, feeling the particular awkwardness of introductions made across such an obvious difference in circumstance. He didn't press further into our business that first meeting, simply nodding politely and gathering his purchases, though I noticed, walking out of the store myself a few minutes later with our own considerably smaller parcel, that he'd lingered near his wagon rather than riding off immediately. I glanced back once, unable to help my own curiosity, and saw him standing quietly beside his horse, watching Danny and me make our way down the street, with an expression I couldn't properly read from that distance, though something in his stillness suggested a man turning some private thought over carefully, rather than simply waiting idly for his own business to conclude. My own wound, the one that made accepting even ordinary kindness feel like a small defeat those 2 years, went back to my husband Thomas's death from a fever that had swept through our small farming community, taking him and 11 others in a single terrible month, leaving me with a boy not yet 6 and a rented house I could barely keep on the wages available to a widow with no trade beyond what any farm wife learned by necessity. I had built, in the 2 years since, a particular careful pride around managing alone, understanding that accepting help too readily risked becoming, in the town's careful accounting, a charity case, rather than a woman capable of providing for her own son, a distinction that mattered more to my remaining dignity than I always found easy to explain. I remembered, with particular clarity, the specific week Thomas had died, the fever moving through him faster than the traveling doctor could properly treat it. And I remembered, too, the particular kindness and pity that had poured through our small community in the weeks immediately following, casseroles and offers of help that had gradually thinned, as such things always do, into the ordinary background indifference of a town that had its own considerable hardships to manage without dwelling too long on one widow's particular grief. I had learned in the 2 years since to expect that thinning, to build my own careful self-sufficiency around the plain fact that sympathy rarely outlasted its first few weeks, however genuine it felt in the moment it was offered. I didn't see Nathaniel Cross again for nearly 3 weeks, though Danny mentioned the boots more than once in the days following, a small, persistent longing I did my best to redirect toward gratitude for what we did have, rather than dwelling on what we lacked. The next encounter came at the same general store, a chance meeting that felt, looking back, considerably less like chance than I understood at the time, given how precisely it coincided with my own regular Tuesday trip for supplies. He greeted us both by name, a small courtesy that struck me as more significant than it probably should have, given how rarely anyone in town beyond Mr. Whitfield himself bothered remembering a widow's particulars with any care. He asked after Danny's schooling, after my own work, ordinary questions asked with what seemed like genuine rather than merely polite interest, and I found myself, despite my careful reserve, answering more openly than I'd intended, describing the washing work and the modest rented house and the particular daily balance of managing alone. He asked specifically, I remember, whether Danny showed any particular aptitude at his schooling, a question that surprised me, given how few people beyond the school teacher herself had ever inquired after my son's actual progress, rather than simply his general well-being. I told him Danny had a genuine gift for arithmetic that his teacher praised regularly, a small point of pride I rarely had occasion to share with anyone. And Nathaniel's evident interest in that particular detail, asking a follow-up question about what kind of sums Danny enjoyed most, struck me as considerably more attentive than most adults manage toward a child who wasn't their own. I remember feeling, that afternoon, a particular unfamiliar lightness and simply being asked genuine questions by someone who seemed to actually want the honest answers rather than the carefully brief responses most townsfolk expected from a woman in my position, responses that let them feel appropriately sympathetic without requiring them to sit with the fuller weight of what that sympathy might actually demand. Nathaniel listened the way I imagined a good doctor might listen, attentive without hurrying me toward some tidier conclusion, and I found myself, walking home afterward, replaying pieces of our conversation with a frequency that surprised and slightly unsettled me. The first emotional peak came on a bitter cold morning in early November, when Danny's boots finally gave out entirely on the walk to school, the sole tearing free completely in the mud half-mile from the schoolhouse, leaving him to walk the remaining distance with his foot wrapped in nothing but a stocking soaked through with icy mud. His teacher, a kind young woman named Miss Prentice, told me later that she'd noticed him limping through the afternoon lessons and had asked what happened, and Danny, with the particular stubborn pride children sometimes inherit without anyone specifically teaching it to them, had insisted he was fine, rather than admit the true state of his footwear in front of his classmates. I understood that particular instinct all too well, recognizing in my own son the same careful, protective pride I had spent 2 years cultivating in myself, a pride that had apparently already taken root in him, despite my efforts to shield him from the fuller weight of our circumstances. He arrived home that afternoon with a fever building, the particular sick warmth of a child who'd spent hours with a wet foot in freezing weather, and I spent that whole night sitting up beside him, sponging his forehead, terrified in the particular specific way only a mother facing a sick child alone understands, with no husband to share the watching and no money spare for a doctor if the fever worsened past what I could manage myself. I remember the particular quality of that night's fear, distinct from the ordinary daily anxiety I'd grown accustomed to over 2 years of managing alone, a sharper, more immediate terror that kept me pacing between Danny's small bed and the kitchen window, watching for any sign of dawn that might bring some relief through simple daylight, even though I understood rationally that sunrise itself would change nothing about his condition. I prayed that night with a fervency I hadn't managed since Thomas's own final days, bargaining with a God I wasn't entirely certain was listening, promising anything at all in exchange for my son's simple recovery. Nathaniel Cross appeared at my door the following morning, unannounced, and I later learned, having heard from Mr. Whitfield's wife, that Danny had taken ill after his boots failed him on the walk to school, a piece of town gossip that had apparently traveled with unusual speed given how directly it concerned him. I later learned that Mrs. Whitfield, unlike her husband's usual careful discretion regarding customers' private circumstances, had mentioned Danny's illness to several other women at the church sewing circle that same morning, a piece of casual conversation that had somehow, through whatever mysterious channels small-town gossip traveled, reached Nathaniel's own household staff before noon, prompting him to ride the considerable distance into town rather than wait for his next scheduled supply trip. He carried a small parcel and asked with a directness I hadn't expected whether he might see how the boy was faring, an offer I nearly refused out of the same careful pride that had governed most of my decisions those 2 years, before Danny's own weak, hopeful voice from the next room settled the matter for both of us. The small parcel, I discovered once I'd finally accepted his visit, contained a jar of honey and a length of soft flannel meant for wrapping a sick child's chest against the cold. Practical, unglamorous gifts that told me considerably more about the man's genuine character than anything more elaborate might have communicated. He didn't make a show of the gesture, simply setting the parcel on my kitchen table and asking, plainly, how he might help through the day, an offer of practical assistance rather than empty sympathy that I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, accepting without much further argument. We sat together that whole day, an arrangement neither of us named plainly, but that felt, by evening, considerably more than a simple neighborly check on a sick child. He told me, sitting across from me at my own small kitchen table while Danny slept fitfully in the next room, about his own wife, Ellen, dead 3 years now from complications in childbirth, along with the daughter who would have been their first. A loss that had taught him, he said, more than he ever wanted to know about grief too large to speak plainly, and about the particular mercy of someone simply being present without demanding explanation. He described Ellen carefully, the particular quality of her laugh that had first drawn him to court her, the small ranch house they'd built together in their first years of marriage, and the specific, terrible morning the doctor had told him there was nothing more medicine could do for either his wife or the daughter she'd been carrying. He said he'd spent the 3 years since running his ranch alone with a kind of grim efficiency that left little room for anything beyond the day's necessary work, and that something about Danny's plain, unguarded longing for a pair of boots had cracked open a part of himself he'd kept carefully sealed since Ellen's death. I told him about Thomas, about the fever that had taken him within a single terrible week, about 2 years of careful, exhausted management that had left me too tired most nights to properly grieve what I'd actually lost. We turned to look at each other across that small table sometime near dusk, exhaustion and something else entirely plain on both our faces, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. The kitchen had gone dim around us as the afternoon light faded, and neither of us had thought to light a lamp yet, content somehow to sit in that particular gray, comfortable quiet while Danny's breathing settled into something steadier in the next room. I remember noticing in that fading light the particular careful gentleness in Nathaniel's expression, nothing performed or calculated about it, simply a man sitting quietly with a woman and her sick child because he genuinely wanted to be there rather than because any obligation required it. I felt something in my chest go still and waiting, the particular held breath feeling of a moment about to become something else entirely. And then Danny's fever-weakened voice called out from the next room needing water, and we both moved at once to answer him, and whatever had been building in that quiet kitchen dissolved into the ordinary, urgent business of tending a sick child before either of us had said what needed saying. The dark turn, if a story built on borrowed boots and quiet kindness can be said to have one, came 3 days later, once Danny's fever had broken, and I'd had time to properly reckon with what accepting Nathaniel's continued visits might mean for a widow already watched carefully by a town inclined toward gossip about a woman managing alone. Mrs. Abernathy, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the moral compass of our small community, made her disapproval known plainly at the following Sunday service, remarking, loud enough for half the congregation to hear, that a widow entertaining a wealthy rancher's visits so soon and so frequently ought to consider what conclusions decent people might reasonably draw from it. Mrs. Abernathy had built her particular standing in town around exactly this kind of careful moral surveillance, cataloging other people's behavior with a thoroughness that left little room for charitable interpretation. And I understood, hearing about her comments, that she'd likely been watching Nathaniel's visits with considerable interest for weeks before finally voicing her disapproval publicly. Several other women in the congregation, I learned, had offered quieter but similar opinions in the days following, though none with quite Mrs. Abernathy's particular relish for public correction. I heard about her comments secondhand, the way a woman usually hears the worst things said about her, and I told myself it didn't matter, though it mattered considerably more than I let on, because I understood exactly how quickly a widow's reputation could curdle from sympathetic to suspect in a town with little else to occupy its collective attention. I told Nathaniel, the next time he called, that perhaps his visits ought to become less frequent, that I appreciated his kindness toward Danny, but couldn't afford, in the particular precarious position I occupied, to give the town further reason to question my judgment or my character. He was quiet a long moment on my own porch, weighing something behind his steady hazel-green eyes, before he told me something that reframed the whole month between us. He said he understood exactly the particular unfair weight a widow carried in a small town's careful accounting, having watched his own mother navigate similar scrutiny after his father's early death, and that he had no intention of adding to that weight through carelessness. But he said, too, that stepping back entirely felt to him like a considerably greater mistake than continuing carefully, and that he'd rather face down Mrs. Abernathy's gossip directly than pretend, for the sake of appearances, that what had grown between Danny and me over recent weeks meant nothing to him. He spoke plainly, standing there on my porch in the fading autumn light, about his own careful calculation of what mattered more, the town's temporary disapproval or the genuine connection he'd found with both Danny and me over the past month, a connection he said felt considerably rarer and more valuable than 3 years of careful solitary grief had taught him to expect finding again. I listened to him lay out that particular reasoning with the same steady, unhurried manner he brought to most things, and I understood, even as I maintained my own careful caution, that I was witnessing a man making a genuine choice rather than simply offering easy reassurance. The turning point came from Danny himself, in the plain, unfiltered way only a child delivers hard truths. He found me in the kitchen the following evening, still turning over Nathaniel's words, and he asked, without any of the careful diplomacy an adult might have used, whether Mr. Cross was going to stop visiting because of what Mrs. Abernathy had said in church, because he'd heard the older boys at school repeating some version of her comments and didn't understand why being kind to a sick boy should make grown-ups so angry. I didn't have a ready answer for that, standing there with a boy's plain confusion laid bare in front of me, and hearing it said so simply by my own son undid something I'd been holding together through sheer careful pride. I sat down with Danny at the kitchen table, both of us silent for a long moment while I gathered the words to answer a question that deserved considerably more honesty than the careful deflections I'd offered most of his childhood's harder questions. I told him, as plainly as I understood how to explain it to an 8-year-old, that some grown-ups worried too much about what other people thought, and that Mr. Cross's kindness toward him had nothing whatsoever to do with anything Mrs. Abernathy or anyone else might say about it. Danny considered this explanation with the particular serious concentration children bring to matters that genuinely puzzle them, then asked with the same plain directness why I'd asked Mr. Cross to step back if his kindness truly didn't need anyone's approval. I found Nathaniel at the general store 2 days later, and I told him plainly that I'd been wrong to ask him to step back, that Mrs. Abernathy's opinion of my character mattered considerably less to me than continuing to know a man who'd shown my son more genuine kindness in a single afternoon than most of the town had managed in 2 full years. He listened to that admission with the same steady, unhurried attention he brought to most things, and told me, once I'd finished, that he'd been waiting 3 days for exactly that particular change of heart, having spent them worried he'd pushed too hard against a caution that had, after all, kept me and Danny safe through 2 considerably difficult years on my own. We stood there in the middle of Whitfield's store, near enough the exact spot where Danny had first stared at his new boots 2 months before, and I felt the particular strange symmetry of that location settling over the conversation, as though the whole story had circled back deliberately to its own beginning. Mr. Whitfield, busy with another customer at the far counter, gave us the small privacy such a public conversation could manage, and I understood, standing there, that whatever remained of my careful widow's caution had finally given way to something considerably more certain. The resolution unfolded over the following months without any single dramatic turn. Nathaniel continued visiting, openly and without apology, and though Mrs. Abernathy's disapproval never fully vanished, enough of the town came to know him well enough, watching his patient, unhurried devotion to both Danny and me, that her particular brand of suspicion found less and less fertile ground to grow in. Word of Nathaniel's steady, unhurried courtship spread through the town's usual channels considerably faster than Mrs. Abernathy's original gossip had, and I noticed over those following weeks a subtle but real shift in how several townswomen greeted me at church and market, a warmth that had been noticeably absent during my hardest early months of widowhood, when sympathy had felt more like careful distance than genuine welcome. I understood that shift as its own small vindication, proof that a story built on patient, honest kindness could eventually outweigh even the most confident gossip. He taught Danny to ride that spring, a skill my son took to with an enthusiasm that told me plainly how much a boy without a father had been quietly hungry for exactly this kind of steady, patient male attention. He never once, in all those months, made me feel that his kindness came with any unspoken debt attached, a distinction I had learned to watch for carefully after 2 years of occasionally less generous offers from men who expected gratitude to eventually take a particular shape. That spring brought other small proofs of his particular steady character beyond the riding lessons. He repaired our back porch step without being asked, mentioned once and then never again that he'd noticed our coal supply running low before a hard freeze, and always, without fail, treated Danny's questions and small enthusiasms with the same patient seriousness he'd shown from that very first conversation in Whitfield's store. Mrs. Abernathy's disapproval, when I encountered it directly on the rare occasions our paths crossed at church socials, gradually softened into a kind of grudging, unspoken acceptance, though she never once, that I recall, offered anything resembling a direct apology for her earlier comments. We were married the following autumn, almost exactly 1 year after that first afternoon in Whitfield's general store, in a small ceremony that Mrs. Abernathy, in the end, attended and even wept through, having apparently reconciled herself sometime over the intervening year to a story that had turned out considerably more respectable than her original suspicions suggested. Danny stood beside Nathaniel at the altar, having asked with the particular solemnity of an 8-year-old handling important business whether he might be the one to hand over the ring, a request Nathaniel had granted without a moment's hesitation. Danny had practiced the small task for nearly a week beforehand, I later learned, rehearsing the short walk from his designated spot to Nathaniel's side with a seriousness that made both Nathaniel and me privately smile whenever we noticed him pacing out the distance in our own front room. When the actual moment arrived, he performed his small duty with a solemn, careful pride that brought tears to more than one eye in that small congregation, myself included, understanding as I watched him that he'd found in Nathaniel exactly the kind of steady presence I'd worried, through our hardest years, he might never have the chance to know. The wedding itself took place in the small church where Mrs. Abernathy had once voiced her disapproval so publicly, a detail I appreciated more than I let on to anyone at the time, understanding it as its own quiet vindication of a story that had, in the end, proven her original suspicions entirely wrong. Mrs. Abernathy herself sat near the front that day, having spent the years since her original comments gradually softening into something closer to grudging respect, and I watched her dab at her eyes more than once during the ceremony, a reaction I found genuinely surprising given how firmly she'd once positioned herself against exactly this outcome. Nathaniel told me afterward, with the particular dry humor he rarely showed but that I'd come to treasure, that Mrs. Abernathy's tears owed less to sentiment than to the sheer novelty of a scandal she'd predicted turning out considerably more respectable than she'd originally forecast. Mr. Whitfield closed his store for the afternoon to attend, along with most of the families whose washing had once kept Danny and me fed through our hardest years, and I remember looking out at that gathered congregation during the ceremony and understanding, with a clarity that nearly undid my composure, exactly how far we'd traveled from that cold October afternoon when I'd whispered my tired promise about making do. Several of those washing families had brought small gifts they could ill afford, tokens of gratitude I hadn't expected, and found myself considerably moved by, understanding that the particular dignity I'd tried to maintain through 2 hard years of careful labor had apparently been noticed and valued by people I'd never once imagined were paying that close attention to my own quiet struggle. Miss Prentice, Danny's teacher, attended too, seated near the back with an expression of genuine warmth that told me she'd followed our story's development with more personal investment than her professional distance usually permitted her to show. I think, sometimes, about that first ordinary Tuesday in the general store, Danny's small, unguarded longing for a stranger's new boots, my own tired whispered promise that we'd make do with what we had. I understand now that we did make do in the end, though not in the way I'd expected that afternoon, watching a rancher's fine boots with the particular careful resignation of a woman who'd stopped expecting anything beyond bare survival. What we made do with in the end turned out to be considerably more than either Danny or I had any reason to hope for that cold October day, and I've never once since needed to whisper that particular tired promise to my son again. We live now on Nathaniel's own ranch 20 miles west of the small town where Danny and I once managed carefully on washing wages and careful arithmetic, a modest but comfortable house that Nathaniel built with his own 2 hands the year Ellen died and never quite finished furnishing properly until I arrived to help him complete it at long last. Danny has taken to ranch life with an enthusiasm that continues to surprise even Nathaniel himself, learning to ride and rope and manage stock with the particular dedicated focus of a boy who'd spent years without a father's steady guidance and had apparently been storing up considerable appetite for exactly this kind of patient instruction. The boots themselves, the very ones that started this whole particular story, sit now in a small trunk in our bedroom, patched and worn nearly through despite my very best mending, kept not out of any remaining practical need, but simply because Nathaniel asked, once we were properly married, whether he might keep them as a particular lasting reminder of the exact moment he first understood what mattered most to him in this world. I found that request considerably more moving than any grander romantic gesture might have managed, understanding it as entirely characteristic of a man who'd shown his devotion from the very first afternoon in Whitfield's store through plain, practical care, rather than empty declaration, a pattern that has never once wavered in all the years since. We have a daughter now, too, just 2 years old, born the autumn following our marriage, and I watch Nathaniel with her some quiet evenings, the particular careful tenderness he brings to her small daily needs, and understand fully that whatever grief he carried through those 3 long years alone after Ellen's death has finally found somewhere safe and permanent to set itself down. Danny dotes on his little sister with a fierce, protective seriousness that reminds me, more than I usually let myself acknowledge, of his own father's steady temperament, a quality I'm glad to see surviving in him despite the 2 hard years he spent without Thomas's example to follow directly. I think often, watching my son with his sister, about how easily his early years without a steady father figure might have hardened him into someone considerably less gentle, and I credit Nathaniel's patient, consistent presence over these past years with helping Danny grow into exactly the kind of protective, warm older brother I'd hoped he might become, rather than someone shaped primarily by the harder lessons of our 2 lean years alone. It is, I've come to believe, one of the quieter but truest measures of a good man, not simply how he treats the woman he loves, but how patiently and consistently he shows up for a child who isn't his own by blood, expecting nothing beyond the plain privilege of being trusted with that particular responsibility.